Clara Whelan counted backward through the months the way a woman counts stitches she means to pull. October, September, August, July, June, May, 6 months of milk pails and bread dough, and a boy who watched her from doorways as if memorizing the shape of someone who might leave. She untied her apron, folded it once along the crease she had ironed into it herself, and laid it across the back of the kitchen chair. Then she went upstairs to collect her bag. Eli Drennan stood at the bottom of the stairs with his hands at his sides and his boots still muddy from the morning milking. He was 8 and had his father's habit of standing very still when he did not know what to do. He watched her climb. He did not ask where she was going. He had learned, in the way children learn such things, that asking the wrong question at the wrong time could bring an answer you were not prepared to carry. The terms had been stated plainly the first afternoon she arrived, standing in the yard with her one carpet bag and the letter from the church society folded in her coat pocket. Amos Drennan needed a woman to run the house and help with the dairy. His wife, Ellen, had been dead 14 months. The dairy was a small operation along the Saline River Valley in central Kansas. 12 cows, a spring house built into the hillside, a butter route into town every Wednesday and Saturday. He stood in the yard with his sleeves rolled past his elbows and his hat pushed back and stated the terms as if he were reading them off a posted bill. $4 a month, room and board included. Sundays her own, unless the cows needed tending, which they always did. Clara had repeated the number back to him to be sure she had heard it right. $4 a month. He had nodded once and picked up her bag and carried it inside, and that had been the whole of the interview. No questions about her cooking. No questions about her character or her references or why a woman of 29 was available for hire at all. He needed someone. She was someone. The arrangement proceeded on those terms. She had come from a position in Abilene that had ended when the family moved to Missouri without notice. Before that, she had kept house for a widowed pastor in Ellsworth who had remarried and no longer required her services. Before that, she had been married for 11 months to a man named Joseph Whelan who died of typhoid the winter after the wedding, leaving her with his name and a trunk she had sold for the train fare west. She owned one carpet bag, a Bible with her mother's name written in the front in faded ink, a set of steel knitting needles, and a comb with 3 teeth missing. She was not destitute. She was something quieter and more persistent than destitution. She was unclaimed. She belonged to no household, and no household belonged to her, and in the prairie country in 1882 that was a condition that pressed against a woman from all sides like wind. The house was clean but starved of everything that made a house worth standing inside. Amos kept it swept and the dishes washed because he was a man who could not tolerate filth, but there was nothing soft anywhere in it. No curtains at the windows, no cloth on the table, no jar of wildflowers on the sill. The food was salt pork and cornbread and coffee that tasted as if it had been boiled since the war and never poured out. The pantry had flour, lard, salt, coffee, and a tin of baking soda with the lid rusted open. Eli ate what was put in front of him and cleared his plate to the basin and said thank you in a voice that expected nothing in return. He had a younger sister buried in the yard beside his mother, dead at 3 months of the croup. And he had learned before he could read that the people you lived with could disappear between one season and the next, and the table would be set with one fewer plate, and nobody would speak of it. Clara started with the kitchen, because the kitchen was where the day began, and if the beginning was wrong, then everything that followed leaned. She scoured the iron pots with sand and lye until the burnt crust of months came away, and the metal rang when she tapped it. She rehung the stovepipe where it had sagged and was leaking smoke into the room along the seam. She found a flour barrel full of weevils, emptied it into the yard, scrubbed the barrel with boiling water and soda, dried it in the sun, and filled it with clean flour she bought on Amos's account at Ridley's store in town. She did not ask permission for any of it. She measured the need and she answered it, and she moved on to the next thing. The dairy was worse. The spring house had not been properly scrubbed since Ellen died, and the shallow cream pans had a film on them that no amount of hot water would shift. Clara lifted one of the pans to the morning light that came through the door and ran her thumb along the inside edge. The tin lining was pitted. Tiny craters in the surface where milk fat had settled and gone rancid. And once tin pitted like that, you could scald it every day for a year, and the taste would come through. She set the pan down and examined the rest, 8 pans in the spring house, and 5 of them ruined past saving. She said nothing about it. She strained the milk through doubled cheesecloth, skimmed the cream into the 3 good pans, and churned in the cool of early morning before the heat of the day could soften the butter. The churning took the better part of an hour with the old dash churn, working the plunger in a steady rhythm until the buttermilk broke and the yellow flecks gathered and clung. She worked the butter on a wet board with a wooden paddle, pressing and folding, squeezing out the last of the buttermilk so the finished block would keep without turning. She salted it evenly. She shaped it in the mold Amos's wife had used, a simple rectangle with a wheat sheaf carved into the top. On Wednesday, when Amos loaded the wagon for the town route, Mrs. Hartwell at the dry goods store turned the block in her hands and held it to her nose and said it was the best butter she had tasted from the Drennan place since Ellen was alive. Amos looked at Clara standing beside the wagon with her sleeves rolled past her elbows and flour dust still in the fold of her collar. He said nothing, but he looked at her as if he were seeing something he had not expected to find where he had left it. The first month ended, and he did not pay her. Clara noticed. She noticed the way a seamstress notices a pulled thread, not with alarm but with the patient certainty that the hole would grow if left alone. She did not mention it. There was wood to split and bread to set, and a boy who had begun to stand closer to her in the kitchen, not touching, not speaking, just present. The way a barn cat will settle near a warm stove it is decided to trust. Eli had begun leaving small signs that he was paying attention. He brought in the eggs without being asked. He stacked the firewood against the kitchen wall in the order Clara used it, kindling on top, split oak on the bottom, so she would not have to rearrange it every morning. One evening she found that he had set her place at the table before she came in from the spring house, laying the fork and knife in the right positions the way she had taught him without realizing she was teaching. Then, on a Tuesday morning in the 2nd month, Clara came downstairs to the kitchen and found a small flat stone on the table beside her coffee cup. It was smooth and gray, pulled from the creek bed, and it had been washed clean and dried. She picked it up and turned it in her fingers. Eli was sitting across the table eating his porridge with his spoon held in his fist, the way boys hold spoons. He did not look up. He did not explain. Clara put the stone in her apron pocket and carried it through the day, and by evening she had reached in and touched it 4 times without deciding to. At the end of the 2nd month, when the wages did not come again, she found a 2nd stone beside her cup. Same size, same careful washing. She placed it beside the first on the windowsill above the basin where she washed her face each morning, and she understood without being told that the boy was counting. 1 stone for each month she worked, and was not paid. It was not a protest. It was a record. It was the act of a child who believed that if you kept count of something, it could not be taken from you without someone knowing the cost. Almost saw the 2 stones on the sill one evening when he came inside to wash. His eyes moved across them and rested there for the space of a breath, and then moved away. He dried his hands on the towel she had hung on the nail by the door and went to sit at the table where the food was already set and the lamp was already lit and the whole kitchen smelled of biscuits she had made from, the flour she had bought, and the butter she had churned and the oven she had cleaned. He ate. He did not pay her. He did not mention the stones. Clara discovered the deeper cause of the butter trouble in the 3rd month. The pitted pans were the visible problem, but beneath it lay the spring house itself. The channel cut into the floor, which carried cold creek water beneath the stone shelf to keep the pans cool, had silted up with clay and gravel over the months since Ellen's death. The water still ran, but slowly, and the temperature on the shelf had risen by enough degrees to turn cream sour before it could be properly skimmed. Clara spent a full day on her hands and knees in the spring house, with a flat shovel and a tin bucket, clearing the channel stone by stone, handful by handful, until the water ran clean and fast and cold enough to numb her fingers. She packed fresh gravel into the low spots and reset the stones that lined the edges and tested the flow with a stick to be sure nothing pooled. Then she asked Amos to order 3 new cream pans from the hardware dealer in town. He looked at the cost written on the order form. He looked at her. He signed where she pointed. Within a month, the butter was as good as anything in the county. Firm, sweet, with a clean finish that held its flavor for a week in a covered crock. Mrs. Hartwell doubled her standing order. The hotel dining room took a weekly supply. A rancher's wife from 12 miles north sent her hired man with a jar packed in straw and payment in advance and a note saying she had heard the Drennan butter was worth the ride. Clara kept the accounts in a ruled copybook she had bought for 15 cents at Ridley's store. She recorded every sale, every expense, every pound of butter churned, and every gallon of milk sold. She did this not because Amos asked her to, but because it needed doing, and because she had discovered, in the 3rd month, that Amos could not do it himself. A letter had come from the bank in town regarding a note on the property, and Amos held it for 2 days without opening it. Clara watched him set it on the bureau each morning and pick it up each evening and set it down again. When she finally asked if there was something she could help with, he placed the letter on the kitchen table and went outside without a word. She opened it and read it and understood 2 things at once. The note was current and not in danger of being called, and Amos could not read well enough to know that. She said nothing about it. She wrote a reply to the bank in careful, clear hand, brought it to him in the barn, and read it aloud as if she were simply checking her own work before posting. He signed where she pointed. She sealed the envelope and gave it to Eli to carry to the post office the next morning. The matter was settled. She never mentioned his difficulty again, and he never explained it, and between them the silence on the subject became a kind of wall they had built together from the same stones, each carrying from their own side. The 3rd stone appeared on the windowsill. Then, the 4th. Clara found herself checking the sill each morning, the way she checked the stove and the water pail and the level of flour in the barrel. The stones were always washed, always the same size, always placed in a neat line with even spacing. Eli never spoke about them. He placed them while she slept and watched her find them with the quiet, steady expression his father wore when paying close attention to something he intended to act on but would not yet name. In the 5th month, the trouble came from town. Mrs. Everett, who ran the Ladies' Aid at the Methodist Church and managed the moral temperature of the county with the same firm hand she applied to her preserves, called on a Saturday afternoon. She sat in Clara's kitchen and drank Clara's coffee and ate a biscuit from Clara's oven and looked around the room with the careful inventory of a woman who has come to assess, not to visit. She observed that it was unusual for a young woman to live under the roof of a widowed man for so long without any formal arrangement being made known to the community. She did not say improper. She did not need to. The word filled the kitchen the way smoke fills a room, touching everything, leaving its smell on the curtains Clara had sewn, and the tablecloth Clara had hemmed, and the shelf where Clara had lined up the spices she had ordered on her own account, because the food in this house deserved better than salt and prayer. Clara thanked her for the visit and walked her to the buggy and stood on the porch with her hands folded until the dust settled behind the wheels. Then she went back inside and finished the ironing. Her hands were steady. Her jaw ached from holding it still. Amos heard about the visit from Ridley at the store the following Wednesday. Clara knew he had heard because he came home and set the provisions on the table harder than necessary and went to the barn and did not come in for supper. Eli carried a plate out to him and came back with it empty and said nothing about what his father looked like eating alone in the cold barn with the horses shifting in their stalls. Clara did not go out to him. She understood that whatever Amos chose to do about Mrs. Everett's observation, he would have to choose it without being led, or the choosing would belong to Mrs. Everett and not to him. He did nothing. The fifth stone appeared on the windowsill, and Clara looked at the 5 of them standing in their row and calculated $20 she had earned and not received, and weighed it against the boy who left his school copybook on the table each evening so she would check his sums, and the quiet of the kitchen when the lamp was lit and the bread was cooling and the day's accounts were written, and the house, for those few hours, belonged to her in every way that mattered except the one way that would let her stay in it with her name intact. She stayed through the 5th month. She stayed because leaving required deciding that the stones on the windowsill and the sums in the copybook and the butter on the shelf and the boy beside her at the table meant less than the $20 and the talk in town. She could not yet make that arithmetic come out right. The 6th month turned, and the 6th stone appeared, and then the letter came from Abilene. Mrs. Carlyle, Clara's former employer, wrote that her sister in Lawrence needed a housekeeper and would pay $6 a month in cash, with a private room and every other Sunday free, and no ambiguity about the terms. It was a genuine offer. It was a better position. It was a door standing open in a wall she had been pressing against for 6 months. And Clara read the letter twice and set it on the bureau in her room and understood that the arithmetic had finally come out. She could not stay where she was not valued enough to be paid. Staying without wages had been an act of trust. Continuing to stay had become an act of something she did not want to name, something that lived in the space between charity and desperation and looked, from the outside, exactly the way Mrs. Everett said it looked. She would not become that woman. She had mended boots and churned butter and kept books and read letters and set stones on a windowsill for 6 months, and if that was not enough to be counted, then the counting was broken and she could not fix it by staying longer. She told Amos at supper on a Thursday evening. She spoke plainly, in the way he preferred, with her hands on the table and her eyes on his. She had received an offer of a position in Lawrence. She would leave at the end of the week. She thanked him for the work and said nothing whatsoever about the wages. Amos set his fork on the edge of his plate. He looked at her across the table with an expression she had not seen before. It was not anger. It was the look of a man who has walked past the same fence post every morning for a year and just noticed it is rotted through at the base, and the whole fence is about to go, and the fault is entirely his own, and there is no one to blame and no way to undo the rot by staring at it. He said he understood. Clara washed the dishes. Eli dried them beside her, reaching for each plate without being handed it, the way they had done every evening for 6 months. When the last plate was on the shelf, the boy went upstairs. Clara hung the towel on the nail and went to the porch and sat in the dark and listened to the wind moving through the cottonwoods along the creek and did not cry. She was not a woman who cried about money. She was a woman who cried about being uncounted, and she would do that later, alone, where it could not be mistaken for a negotiation. In the morning, she came downstairs and found Eli standing at the kitchen table. He had gathered the 6 stones from the windowsill and arranged them in a line across the table, evenly spaced, each one a full hand's width from the next. Beside the stones he had placed his school copybook, open to a page near the back. Clara came closer. The page was divided into 6 sections, each headed with a month written in the boy's careful, oversized letters. Under each month he had made a list. October had 4 entries: baked bread every day, fixed the stovepipe, washed all the pans, cut my hair. November had 5, made the butter good, ordered new pans, read the bank letter for Pa, helped with my sums, stayed when it got cold. The lists continued through the months, growing longer, the handwriting growing smaller to fit more entries on the page. March, the final section, had 9 entries. The last one, written in pencil pressed so hard it had dented the paper, read, "Mended my boots so they would fit right." Eli stood with his hands at his sides. He looked at Clara with his father's eyes in his mother's face, and he spoke in the plain, unhurried voice of a child who has done the arithmetic and found the answer short. "That is 6 months. I counted every one. You worked every single day. And Pa never paid you. I do not think you should go to Lawrence. I think Pa owes you, and he should pay you, and then you should stay." He stopped. He picked up the first stone from the line and held it out to her on his open palm. "This one is October. You made the coffee stop tasting burnt." Clara took the stone. Her hand was not steady. She held it and looked at the boy and could not find a single word that was equal to what he had laid on the table. Amos stood in the doorway. He had come in from the barn and stopped at the threshold and heard it all. He looked at his son. He looked at the open copybook with its 6 columns of a child's handwriting. He looked at the 5 remaining stones on the table and at the woman holding the first one in her open hand, and something moved behind his expression that had been locked for a long time. He went to the bedroom. Clara heard a drawer open and close. He came back carrying a tin box she had seen on his bureau but never touched. He set it on the table beside the stones and lifted the lid. Inside was paper money. He counted it out on the table. $24, 6 months at $4 each. He laid the bills in a stack and pushed the stack across the table toward her. "That is every cent I owe you. I should have paid you the first month and every month after, and I did not, and the reason I did not is that I am a fool who believed that if I owed you money you could not leave, because you would have to stay to collect the debt. And that is no way to keep a woman in a house. That is a way to make sure she walks out of it." He set both hands flat on the table, palms down, fingers spread. "The money is yours whether you stay or go. Your wages are paid. I am asking you now to stay, not as the housekeeper, as my wife. But I am asking after the debt is settled, not before, so that whatever you answer belongs to you and is not something I bought by withholding what I owed." Clara looked at the money on the table. She looked at Eli, who had not moved, who stood holding the remaining 5 stones against his chest the way a boy holds something he has been saving for exactly this purpose. She looked at the tin box and the copybook and the kitchen she had scrubbed and stocked and made into a place worth coming downstairs to every morning. She picked up the bills and folded them once and put them in her apron pocket beside the first stone. Then she reached across the table and took the copybook and closed it and held it against herself. "I will stay." Eli placed the 5 stones back on the windowsill, one at a time, in their order. He set each one with the same deliberate care he had used all along. When the last stone was down, he walked to where Clara stood and positioned himself beside her, close enough that his shoulder pressed against her hip. He did not embrace her. He stood where he had chosen to stand, and the choosing was enough. Amos went to the courthouse on Monday morning. Clara did not know he had gone until Eli mentioned at midday that his father had taken the deed to town. When Amos came home in the late afternoon, he set a folded document on the kitchen table and sat down and said nothing about it. Clara unfolded the paper and read her name written beside his in the county clerk's hand on the amended deed to the farm. Legal and permanent and recorded in a book that anyone in the county could ask to see. They married in June on the porch in a rainstorm that blew in from the west and turned the yard to standing water. The preacher stood under the overhang and read the words, and the wind kept trying to take his pages. Eli stood beside Clara in his mended boots with a stone in his pocket. The October stone. He had asked to keep it, and she had given it without asking why, because she already knew. October was the month she arrived, and the month the counting began, and a boy who keeps count of things needs to hold the first one so he can be certain of all the ones that follow. The other 5 stones stayed on the windowsill. Clara washed them on Saturdays when she cleaned the kitchen, setting each one back in its place the same way she set the plates on the shelf and the bread on the board. They were part of the house now. They were part of the ordinary way things were done in a kitchen that smelled of biscuits and clean cream and belonged, finally and on paper, to the woman who had made it so. On mornings when the light came through early and caught the stones along the sill, Eli counted the shadows while he ate his porridge, not because he needed to. Because counting was what you did when something mattered enough to keep.